Ahoy! The spear got one big change last patch, but that completely changes how the weapon is used. The change in question is a massive buff to Cyclone, and on one hand I want to show you how that changes certain ability chains and what you want to use together, and on the other hand I also want to show you a build that I came up with based on that for the Sandworm specifically, where we also have a few extra qualifiers. So what was changed? The damage of Cyclone was increased from 130 to 165% weapon scaling. Along with that, the animation was sped up, and I would say was sped up quite drastically. I'm playing on PTR where my ping is very high, so all animations are slower, and still it feels like a very quick attack. The hitbox was also extended down a bit to make it less likely to miss the ground. Something worth keeping in mind with the scaling adjustments here is that Cyclone is strike damage, not thrust damage. On one hand, this means that your damage when using a thrust damage ring is slightly lower than on your other abilities, so it's closer to a roughly 150% scaling thrust ability, which would go even because of the extra thrust damage from your ring. On the other hand, this can have benefits both in PvP and in PvE. In PvP, it is fairly common for players, especially in Outpost Rush, to run thrust protection amulets. Strike protection is very rare in comparison, because it's only really used by the hammer a lot, so this will go right past most people's protection. In PvE we have this damage type chart from New World fans, and you can see that we have the thrust weakness on Corrupted and Beast, but most of your damage with a spear will still be thrust anyways, so you're still well suited for that. But along with that, you become a bit of a better all-rounder because you have more strike damage as AoE against Ancients and Lost. So this can often offset the minor damage loss from not having thrust damage bonus, because there are a lot of Ancient and Lost dungeons. Fun fact, the spear has 3 strike abilities. Cyclone, the initial hit of Sweep, and Vault Kick are all strike damage. Now, I saw a comment the other day saying that it's going to be difficult to fit Cyclone into your build because you kind of need every ability on the spear that you're using in PvE at least, being Sweep, Skewer, and Perforate. Now, depending on how your group is set up and how many weakens and rends you have, you may in fact need Skewer and Perforate. That is just entirely up to team comp, but in team comps where that is required, you can only really switch out Sweep. Let's first look at this purely from a damage perspective. We'd lose 45% damage from the initial Sweep, this is strike damage, then 150% from the Coup de Grace effect if you're using that, and then another 9.6 times 8, I think maybe times 9 depending, for the bleed ticks afterwards if you have bleeding Sweep. That would be a total of 272 to 280 weapon damage, and keep in mind that a lot of that damage is in the bleed, so if the target doesn't survive for another 8 seconds afterwards, you will get less. And now look at these timings where I compared with a heavy attack plus Cyclone combo, exactly up until the point where I can dodge again. As you can see, the animation of both attacks is almost the same, goes ever so slightly in favor of Sweep and Coup de Grace, but barely noticeable. On the other hand, the damage to deal with the heavy attack plus Cyclone is much higher. A larger portion of the damage is applied as AoE, and there is no dot involved at all. The total damage of both attacks is a heavy attack with 165% scaling and Cyclone itself with the same scaling, so 330% weapon scaling pretty much instantly. Even if you have a thrust damage ring and the target is weak to thrust, you'll likely still come out on top with Cyclone and the heavy attack because there's no dot and more of it is AoE. On top of all that, Coup de Grace also animation locks you significantly longer, which I always felt like was a big downside of that ability, and is why I rarely use it. I can get similar damage out of doing Sweep and 2 light attacks in the same time. Just to quickly show you, in case you think this is just an animation cancel thing, you can use a heavy attack before Sweep as well, of course, but if you do that, the outcome is very different from the outcome of Cyclone, just because it doesn't really cut off animations once, and the overall animation time for the attack is more than a solid second longer. On the other hand, however, if you're more interested in the AoE CC aspect of Sweep, you can actually chain Sweep and Cyclone as well, and that combo is faster than Sweep and Coup de Grace. It's a small difference of 6 frames, but I think it's worth pointing out in the context of you using this on mob groups, you're using Sweep into Cyclone if you can sacrifice another ability. Last but not least, the skill point and perk investment is also something worth keeping in mind. When it comes to Sweep, you use your first extra point just to get grit, and then the second extra point just to get the extra effect from Coup de Grace, and the weapon perk on top of that just brings you to the level of damage required here. So if you don't have bleeding Sweep in the first place, if you don't have that perk at all, then the comparison is completely pointless because Cyclone will win by a mile. But Cyclone also gets extra effects. By default it has a 50% slow for 3 seconds already and grit, and then the first perk gives you 25 stamina back per target hit, so in a group you will just get full stamina. The pushback perk doesn't have much purpose in most PvE builds, but that means it also frees up a point. We need 3 points for Sweep to be really effective when it comes to damage output. For Cyclone, we just need 1, and we can get free stamina if we want to. Not only that, it also comes with a weapon perk that is insanely good if you're fighting any more than one enemy, because it heals you for 32% of the weapon damage on armor, and this doesn't seem to be target restricted. So based on that, it's fairly hard to justify picking Sweep over Cyclone in most PvE situations, unless you are specifically after the CC, but then you really gotta see if there's something else you want to give instead. But there's some nice solutions and workarounds for that, and I'll talk about that in the next days. So if you'd like to see those builds, then consider subscribing and clicking the bell. That video will be more focused on builds specifically. In this video, I want to talk about one specific other build that I came up with on PTR. The next patch comes with 2 raids, and that comes with a problem for spears as well as some other weapons, because bleeding effects or debuffs in general from the same weapons don't stack. So if you have 10 people in your group using a spear, the bleeding sweep won't stack and the skewer won't stack. There are some very minor workarounds for that, so you can get the bleeds going on 2 people at least, but still, for most people, for most spears, you would not be able to get any extra damage from your bleeds at all, and that's a massive DPS loss. Similar things are true for bleed rapiers or bleed greatswords. There's also another problem, especially with the Sandworm. The follow-through perk on the skewer requires you to crit an enemy in order to get the 20% empower for 10 seconds. When you have guaranteed backstabs, as you have in most expeditions, this is a very consistent uptime, so this is usually factored into any DPS calculation being done. The Sandworm, on the other hand, doesn't have a guaranteed backstab spot. As such, this empower is absolutely not guaranteed. Now obviously you want to have those dots applied by one person at least, so you're going to run one spear in your group that has skewer and that has bleeding sweep, just to get those dots up. Maybe have a build that entirely revolves around bleeds and everything, just so you have the full effect out of it. So that spear player and maybe one backup are then also able to apply enfeebling skewer and apply the weaken and rend from perforate. All the other spear players are not responsible for any debuffs and should just focus on maximizing their damage. Now I'd like to share with you what I have come up with. You can see this build so far, very standard stuff. Basically anything that doesn't focus on heavy attacks, anything that gives us some stamina back in some ways, and anything that gives us extra effects for light attacks, because you are going to be using light attacks here and there. That's just what you do whenever you have downtime. But as you can see, no points in any abilities yet, because that is what we're going to look at here. We're going to put our point into Cyclone, and I think we're also taking the extra stamina, because why not? We're not going to get the knockback here, that's not important for us, but because we're especially looking at a raid boss here, it's not going to be knocked back and the adds aren't really a major concern. But then, instead of going for what you'd usually go for, we change some things up. What stays the same is we're using Perforate simply because it is the highest DPS ability on the spear. And we're just after damage here, 3 very quick attacks, each with 80% weapon scaling. But instead of going for any of the other abilities, we're going for a bit of an unusual contender, which is Vault Kick. Now at this point you may be a little bit confused. You may say, why Vault Kick? That's a very low damaging ability, and that is correct. But Vault Kick comes with some very nice effects. The first one is Relentless Blows. This gives an empower against targets below 50% health if we use Vault Kick, 20% empower for 5 seconds. And different from the empower over here, this one is guaranteed. Doesn't rely on crits or anything, just relies on the target being below 50% health. Typically raid bosses, first 50% are the easy part, the last 50% are the hard part, so that works for us. We're spending more time in that secondary area. Along with that, we definitely want to have continuous motion, that's our big goal here, reduce our cooldowns so we can use Perforate and Cyclone more often, because they are our high damaging abilities. Then we can put 2 more points into Perforate. It's technically not necessary, it's all just debuffs, so your other spear users can already apply them. So that's up to you if you want to do that, but you're kind of left with a lot of points that you can spend anywhere anyways, so why not? And then we're going to get aggressive maneuvers to reduce our cooldowns further, very, very important. We're going to of course get exploited weakness, and we're also going to get exacerbated crits, because we're still going to get a decent amount of crits, especially if you have something like Keen Awareness as well. And we have various Keen perks, because we're also going to get Keen Vault Kick, which is another major factor here, because the extra crit chance on a boss like this is actually quite massive. It's quite significant when it comes to damage output, because you don't have those typical guaranteed backstabs. And then we also are going to get exposed wounds, because of course the target is still going to be bleeding, it's just not going to be our bleeds. As far as I'm aware, the Sandworm does not have any grit at all, and likewise it can't get knocked down. These 3 perks here all affect heavy attacks, so they are irrelevant to us, which kind of leaves our last point in this really. And that's purely because everything else has no purpose for us. Again, we could free up these 2 points as well and put them somewhere else if there was something worth spending that on. Otherwise, this is our whole build, and it revolves around resetting our perforate in Cyclone as often as possible. This is done through sometimes using refreshing jabs, sometimes if you want to using aggressive maneuvers. This can sometimes slow down your DPS a bit, but it doesn't necessarily have a major impact. I did a comparison on a dummy with full health. It was a few seconds difference overall, so really not that big of a deal. And a huge part of the reset is obviously the passive here. If you have some pieces with refreshing and you chain your abilities well, then you can basically almost continuously spam attacks over and over. And if you ever can't, you just dodge and use one of your abilities so it resets the other and then the flow keeps going. I did a very raw dummy test for this, again with a very high ping. With far from optimal gear, I couldn't factor in keen vault kick at all. It was guaranteed backstabs and I didn't have a keen vault kick piece. And in this very raw test, the total time it took me to defeat a dummy from full health with a standard build with a bleeds was 1 minute 28, while with the other build it was 1 minute and 57 seconds. I believe that on good ping with cleaner cancels and with actually good gear with keen vault kick as well as multiple refreshing pieces, these two builds will be extremely close on damage output the second you take away the bleed damage from one of them. At this point I can't with 100% certainty say that it will be better. We will have to test that more on the Sandworm and see which build we get the better time with, but I think it's an experiment worth trying at least. I do want to stress that this build is specifically for Sandworm and we'll see other builds being adjusted in similar ways and is not equally effective in a situation where you don't have multiple spears. If you're interested in more general usable builds for the spear or PvP builds for the spear, then hit subscribe and the bell because those are coming in the next days. Thanks to my patrons for supporting this video and thank you for watching. SLOTH, out.